Hi everyone, Dave Cross again. I just want to give you a real quick rundown of the portal, one of the custom portals that we have and that we're making available for demonstration, at least to kind of give the idea that to customers that they can have self-provisioning, that they can tie back into IPControl with custom portals that are tied specifically to IP assignments and the ability to quickly assign and or search for details relative to those changes. So a few things that I have already set up. One is an IPControl executive system. And what I'm going to be working with is just a few of the subnets that are going to be stored down into the Exton automation ranges container, which will be our site. And in that site, we'll have some details such as geolocation and physical locations. Now, each of these subnets I have defined, we're going to use a couple of user-defined fields that are going to make these subnets available to us, so that by clicking on the properties, you'll be have the ability to go in and assign the VLAN ID. And I'm using both VLAN ID and also an API-enabled checkbox to effectively make subnets available or unavailable based on the API-enabled checkbox. So if you were, say, a customer trying to add new subnets or control the process of which subnets would be assigned in an automation process, we can use those fields to do that. A couple other things that we have here is just some of the defaults showing a subnet policy where we can define the default gateway, which is obviously important for the clients, but also their DNS servers, their forward reverse domains, and where these resource records, when assigned and approved, will be stored within the system. We also have a user that we were defining for the Cisco Live show for 2018 that will effectively enable that administrator to log in, add IP addresses, delete them with full control capacity. But it's going to have a setting where they will not be allowed to change their resource records. So we're going to have, as part of the demonstration, the ability to see the pending resource record state that demonstrates the workflow and how that works. And also lastly in this, the administrator themselves, just as a quick note, that when defining the user in the policy section or in the roles, that you'll need to enable that the administrator has both GUI and API access controls within the policies tab. So new to 2010, new to the version 10 is the Web UI, CLI, or both access. And CLI represents APIs as well, so any custom portals and things. And I have some policies set up for this user, so we're going to kind of just jump right into it. Now, in the portal itself, we just have a simple authentication based on whatever is defined for that particular user. And you're presented really with the stripped down interface just for the purpose of adding, searching, and looking at status of addresses or DNS resource records in this case. So looking at the different tabs, we can go through the search where we can do searches for the IP addresses. And I think we're working on 21. So let's just do an enter. And I've entered some, basic wildcarding capabilities so that if you don't know the full IP address, but you know the first or second octet, you can just simply enter that in and hit enter, and we'll export it out for details and view. But you'll also notice that as we go through this process, you're going to see this kind of eye. It's not staring at you, but what it's enabling basically is that there's more details. Since the DNS records can be quite long, and we're working with kind of a reactive web page, I'm exposing and adding or hiding, unhiding this information as you select it. In areas where you have a red eye means that there are no DNS resource records. So in a reserve case, we don't allow that, which is be appropriate. But as you're working through this and looking at static addresses or anything that might be red, that might be an indicator that also there's missing records that should be updated from that. And when you're ready to clear the search, just hit the X and any one of the right-hand corners here, and that'll clear everything you have. And I don't believe that this user has any pending state, but if it did, by selecting Create or Delete, we should be able to see any of those updates. So I'm going to just kind of quickly go through this. Now, in the VLAN ID, again, we're tying back to 3 subnets, each one of the subnets with a different VLAN ID. But I effectively have only that the API enabled checkbox is enabled on 101. So really what I should be able to see then, if I were to type 101 in the VLAN ID, I should see then that this subnet address should populate with whatever subnets match that criteria, both VLAN ID and API enabled. So as an example, if I go up and hit 201, I do not see a subnet address because I do not have that enabled in the system. If I were to click on the subnet properties, enable that policy, and then try this again, I should be able to, if I had any policies, be able to get a list of subnets that are also enabled. So this once the screen, if it doesn't react immediately, you may just need to clear it first and then, simply do that again to present the dropdown. So let's try that again. 201, we have now our subnet, which is enabled. The next field in the screen is going to be a device name. So if you're assigning a single IP address, every IP address must have a common naming policy, or it needs to be unique in terms of the device. So what we're doing here is saying, by leaving it empty, that I'm going to use a naming policy that's been pre-established. And for different device types, it will prepend a certain number of characters plus a hyphenated IP address. Now, this particular subnet does not have a DNS domain, so I do not have a list for a domain and or resource record availability. So I'm going to go back to my 101, which I know does, and I'm going to go ahead and select my subnet. I'm going to leave the domain empty, and I'm going to, or the name empty, and I'm going to select the domain name, which in my case is dev diamond IP, and that name is determined by the subnet policies, which is reading here the for domains defaults, which I did an API call to get those details. Now, once I'm selecting the domain, that then makes the resource records. We're assuming that we're going to create those records by selecting the domain. And just for the portal's sake, I have just 3 different device types I want my users to work with. So I'm going to select server, and then I've gone out and calculated, or based on the quantities, what's available actually in the subnet for viewing purposes. Now, I only need 5 IP addresses in my case, so I'm going to go ahead and just click 5. And by all means, I'm done with this process, and I can just click download CSV, and I can just go ahead and save that information off. And then I have a file that I can then send over to someone, an administrator, to assign an IP, set up its host name, its IP, and domain. Real simple. Now, but there are other cases here. So again, I might want to search for this information at a later time. And again, I can do that by transaction ID. I can also look at host names that have SRVR as an example and get a search of all of those wildcards as well. So again, quite capable in searching. And in the pending approvals, I believe all of these had the ability to have the records assigned, but they did not. So now my user, I have these IP addresses that have been assigned, and if I click information, we'll see that the resource records are not visible. And the reason that is we've established that there's a resource record workflow enabled that administrators can request their names, but those IP addresses then, or names, go into a pool of addresses that need to be approved in order for that process to be complete. And I'm going to go ahead and refresh my screen so that my policy is up here. And in my pending approvals, now I can see that this particular administrator, Cisco Live 2018, has applied for these IP addresses and these domain names. So the IPs are assigned, but the DNS records are held in this pending state until someone approves these. And of course, over in this screen as well, they show that they're not available. And when I look at them in the pending approvals, that they're still in a create pending state. So to demonstrate the approval process, even while we're here, I'm going to go ahead and select all of these addresses. And I'm going to, go ahead and say DC, okay, everything looks good. Now, the end user is not going to see this, but this will be audited. However, the changes are saved. When we look at the audit reports for the DNS resource records, we'll also see that those addresses were updated with a reason. So they do show up in the into the audit reports. However, they don't show up to the end user per se. And as I look over now at the updates and then back to the creates, I should not see any addresses because they were all approved. And then lastly, if I look at my information screen, because this is all real time, I can then show my resource records. And this type of process occurs in real time here. So now I can go ahead and click done if I'm saved. I could have done this previously, but those addresses would have been available to the DNS once they were approved. Now, kind of in the reverse technology of this, or a reverse philosophy, now that I have these IP addresses assigned and they've been approved, if I were to now roll these back, I've deleted this, so they're no longer assigned, and I actually went out and deleted those 5 records. I now should have delete pending approvals that are also pending some type of change or approval process by an administrator in the approval chain. So now, in order to delete and remove these from DNS, I also need to have some approval process. And I'm just going to go ahead and, we'll accept all of these and, select that. Okay, we'll just do approved. All right, and back over here, those are now gone from my list again. So when I refresh that, they're no longer in create. They're gone there. And then if I were to go out and do a search, those addresses are completely gone. And they do restore back into their available pool. And again, you can start this process and or clear the screen. And again, take a look. But as you log in, log out, you're tying back into your Active Directory and or TACACS or whatever kind of authentication you're using, and back to your administrator's password and policies. So thanks for bearing with me here, and hope this has been helpful, and let us know if you have any questions.